Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. We've in the past dealt many times with landlord and tenant issues, and it seems like that's becoming more and more a problem, for realtors especially. Every time we list a property that's tenanted and the buyer is going to occupy the property, the buyer is not an investor, he's going to move in, and we have to give notice to the tenant to move out, it seems it creates a problem. The tenants see that many times as winning the lottery, and they want to be compensated heavily. Now, the landlord and tenant board says we have to compensate them 1 extra month's rent, but it becomes cash for keys. And we look at how we can minimize the exposure for the owner, landlord, minimize the exposure for yourself as the realtor, and best practices, what we should do as far as notification. Do we deliver a notification on behalf of the landlord? And how do we protect the landlord if the buyer says he's going to move in and isn't going to move in? And how do we handle it if the tenant doesn't move out and they say they're going to move out? A whole host of things we need to look at. And so I'm going to sit down with a guest today, Josh McDougall, who is the managing partner of Your Legal Services. And that's a consortium of lawyers and paralegals. And Josh and others specialize in working with the landlord and tenant board and residential tenancy issues. And so we're going to talk about some of the things he runs across and some of the recommendations that he has for realtors when you run into this situation. Stay with us. So Josh, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the show. I know you're a busy guy, got a lot to do, and it really is a privilege having you on board. As realtors, we are involved more and more, it seems, on selling rented properties, so tenanted properties. And many times the buyers are not investors. The buyers want to occupy the property. The way the agreements of purchase and sale are set up, they promise vacant possession. We've dealt with this on the show before. We've talked about the importance of not promising vacant possession where the buyer agrees to assume the tenant in the event they don't vacate. But you deal with this all the time. Any ideas or suggestions, best practices that you think agents should be aware of or should do when they're structuring an agreement of purchase and sale and there's a tenant involved?
Certainly. And first and foremost, Wayne, thank you very much for having me here. I'm always happy to make the time for you guys. Realistically, in my experience, it all kind of boils down to a misconception or a misunderstanding of the law, where it's not really a business and we don't really have the right or ability to offer it vacant. So the best practices really start as a baseline around the fact that the tenants are entitled to stay. The law says that the covenant on the land, which is the agreement between everybody's, rolls over to the next owner and is supposed to remain that way untouched. So when we talk about giving vacant possession, we're really talking about denying the tenants what is theirs and their rights statutorily, which is where a lot of the issues come from.
Wow.
And so there's so much misinformation that's publicized when we start going down that process with the tenants. It kind of creates this issue where they posture and they give everybody a hard time based on some things that they believe are facts, but it's really misinformation, and it just causes, throws a whole bunch of wrenches in the chain. What I found as a best practice is, as far as the agents are concerned, is one, give a lot of lead time. Often we'll see agreements of purchase and sale that are circulated where the 60-day mark is maybe 1 or 2 days after everything's signed. And the thought process and premise of it is that once everything is executed, they're just going to go and they're going to serve an N-12. That creates a lot of issues. It is my office's practice, separate and apart from an agreement of purchase and sale, when we're dealing with an N-12, it's actually the last thing we ever want to do. We want to try and get the tenant out under any means possible separately. Serving the N-12 or the 60-day notice, which is referred to or inferred as part of the APS, comes with it a lot of obligations at law that you can't work around. You can't, unfortunately. So when we're rushing to serve an N-12 for our clients as a realtor, you're actually obligating your client to the fact that the purchaser is going to move in immediately after the tenant leaves. They're going to stay there for 12 months after.
As a minimum.
As a minimum.
Right.
And within those 12 months, and actually from the date of service of the N-12 until 12 months after the tenant leaves, if the property is listed for sale, listed for rent, any part of it, Okay, even if it's a duplex, the purchaser takes everything over and realizes they can rent out part, you're still in contravention of the law. And if they don't move in right away and use it as their principal residence, your client as a realtor is now open to liability by way of what we call a T5 or a bad faith application, and it's absolutely horrible. And as a landlord, and as somebody who is not pro tenant rights all of the time, I think this issue particularly creates a whole lot of nightmares and liability for your clients, both from the buyer and the seller point of view, because they're both on the hook if it ever goes to the landlord and tenant board. So the lead time creates the ability for negotiations. Okay, the tenant doesn't necessarily need to know that somebody has said, "Yep, I'm taking it," and now there is a timeline. The timeline can be abused. They know that it has to be done by a certain date, and so if they push the envelope, every day that goes forward creates more urgency for the seller in having the tenant leave. So the price tag that they can negotiate or bargain with.
Kind of like cash for keys, you mean?
Well, yeah, and I mean, cash for keys was it's an informal way that we describe the negotiation process to have somebody enter into an N11 or a mutual agreement to terminate the tenancy. The problem is that the cash for keys process, especially when done by an agent, is extremely informal. The problem with that is a lot of times, especially with an N12, it creates the liability that the tenant is agreeing to leave, but not waiving their rights. So what my office has seen, and we've structured a number of times on behalf of tenants, is that the tenancy ends and they took all this money to get the tenancy over, but they haven't waived the obligation of the landlord or the purchaser to stay there for 12 months. So they have the ability to double dip. And at law, if a landlord or a purchaser is found to have served it in bad faith, it is the difference of their rent for 12 months at a minimum. And on a lot of these tenured tenancies, if the rent is $1,200 a month and it's shooting up to to 2,400, we're now looking at 14,000 as soon as we press go.
Right. So you're saying that obviously that there's some liability here if the buyer isn't acting in good faith. How do we protect the seller if the buyer isn't going to go ahead and do what he said he's going to do? He's promising it but not delivering.
So the biggest thing that I would suggest from a pragmatic firefighting standpoint, for lack of better words, is make sure that you are not, on behalf of the seller, opting to serve things at the first available opportunity. Think it out. Make sure that liability-wise, everything is thought out. What I mean by that is we see a lot of clauses within the APS that are vague or they are specific about things that might not necessarily matter. So, for instance, we'll see an APS clause that suggests that the notice to vacate or the N12 can only be circulated in accordance with the Residential Tenancies Act, and for a purchaser or the purchaser's spouse, and it effectively just recites law. And that's what I mean by it's specific, but about things that it doesn't have to be or are a little superfluous, because the law already says it. What it should be specific about are the things that are expected of the purchaser that are not cited in law, but create the legislative test and argument at the board. And what I mean by that is the 12 months after the tenant leaves, the fact that a declaration has to be circulated when...
Speak to me for a second about that declaration.
Yeah. So I'm going to say in 2021, the Residential Tenancies Act was amended. It was actually amended a few times throughout COVID in a staggered sense. But Section 72, I believe, don't quote me on that, but it's in the 70s. It states that a declaration has to be circulated as part of this process. So the purchaser is going to swear that they are staying there for the 12 months. They're going to use it as their principal residence. They're going to move in as soon as possible. And in a good faith basis, they're not going to leave.
When you say circulated, who's that go to?
It has to go to the tenant, and it has to go to the landlord and tenant board. Now, the reason that this is important, and it's worth making note of, is that it used to be we could give that oath or evidence or declaration the day of the hearing. When the act was amended, it made it a requirement that when you advance the L2 application, or the application based off of personal use or purchaser's use, that declaration had to be part of the filing. If it wasn't, the application is dismissed on its face.
Are you suggesting that, presuming that the landlord seller sees no problem, the tenant's indicated he's going to move out, they've been given the notice, that they should go ahead with an L2 anyway to the board?
I am a big fan and advocate for always hedging your bets.
Okay.
And always maintaining all positions all at the same time. So the landlord and tenant board is notoriously backlogged. I think we all know that. You get frustrated over it. You're going to wait no matter what you do. The best practice when I'm dealing with things, and that's as a landlord as well, is I'm going to file with the board at the first chance I have and negotiate while I wait, rather than allowing myself to get further behind in line and then figuring it out, when I get there.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say, if I sum up some of what you said, is, stretch the 60-day in terms of practicality before the deal closes.
Mm-hmm.
Structure the deal. You're not promising vacant possession. Structure the deal so obviously it's the seller, landlord who delivers the notice, not the realtor, and that there's some kind of indemnification built in there. And then there's a declaration made by the buyer, and then send it off to the board along with the L2 before you ever know there's a problem.
Yeah. So, to sum it up in as little words as possible as far as steps go, give yourself as much time and don't serve the N12 unless you absolutely have to. Sometimes a tenant will agree to leave just because you've asked. And if you position it as, we want you to leave, we want to end the relationship, you don't want people coming in and out of your house every day to view the property, let's just end this. And sometimes, knowing that there's not a guillotine over your head or over the landlord's head, the tenant is more likely to accept the deal. If they think that they have a bargaining chip, not so much. That's why the N12 is a last resort. Then serve the N12 if you absolutely have to, because it also comes with obligations attached to it. If you don't serve it, no obligations. When it is done, I am a very large advocate that realtors ought not to have any part of the N12. Yes, the seller is to serve a notice to seek vacant possession for the purchaser's use. But much like the fact that within the APS, it also lists that the balance of the purchase price is going to be transferred via large value transfer systems and will be closed in a certain way, which happens by the lawyer. The vacant possession N12 needs or ought to be done by either the seller themselves on behalf of the purchaser or a licensee of the law society. By aiding, and even though you're trying to do the best for your client, which is admirable, you're opening yourself up to liability in the event it's not done properly, or if your client doesn't truly understand the ramifications, and or you're opening yourself up to liability in conjunction with your client if any of those things happen.
Keep your fingers out of the pie when it comes to delivering it.
Find somebody that you have a good relationship with, that understands how you do business as a realtor. And some realtors and paralegals and lawyers have those forms of relationships, kind of like we do. But that individual will help maintain the relationship between your client and you, and do what's necessary.
Well, make sure it's the client that does it, not the realtor.
Correct.
Okay. Josh, thank you very much for taking the time. Appreciate you watching. Look forward to talking to you again next week.